Basically, as you all know, in comparative business studies, in the broader sense, the word comparative economics, comparative finance, comparative HRM, there's been a growing interest in institutional effects. Now, obviously, there's many different ways we can understand institutions. You know, you can take as, say, per the economics and finance literature, seeing institutions primarily as providers of incentives and disincentives on rational actors. We can take the, I suppose, broadly sociological approach of people like DeMaggio and Powell, political science approach, looking at the relative power of ideologies and parties, Mark Rowe, or, of course, which has been quite influential, the literature of comparative capitalism, you know, in the broader sense of the word, which is primarily the literature, along with literature and finance, I engage with, but from a view to critique and development. Now, all these approaches have very different starting points, assumptions, and I'm happy to explore them a bit more in question time. However, they do have one feature in common, in that they all tend to be quite centered around the nation state. And clusters of states, you know, they argue that. Well, you get certain types of state, certain archetypes of capitalism, and what defines them is really differences in institutional features that are shared within and between nations. Another issue, of course, which is a secondary critique, is that although the literature is not always narrowly based on assumptions of path dependence, there is nonetheless issues of implicit assumptions of continuity. And of course, this becomes quite difficult at the moment when we are in a time of, whatever perspective you're coming from, great fluidity and change. What I thought I'd do today is looking at supranational pressures and then even consequences. However, I will also give some thought to internal diversity in capitalism. If you're interested in my work in the latter regard, fortunately, Routledge at the moment are giving free access to highly cited articles. And if you want the link, I'll give it to you. So, which is an advantage, it's quite generous to them. When we look at the supranational, obviously, if you go back to the literature on international business, say 15, 20 years, there's a lot of talk about globalization. In contrast to that very crude literature, the more sophisticated literature on second image reversed, you know, Peter Gurevich and co., argued that there were these supranational pressures in a whole range of areas that sort of gradually were emasculating the distinct features of individual nation states. Now, obviously, you can look at this literature in all sorts of ways. However, the trouble with this literature tends to conflate a lot of very different kind of things. Nonetheless, on the other hand, the literature on comparative capitalism, or comparative finance literature, whatever, talks a lot about comparison. It doesn't talk necessarily all that much as we'd think about capitalism. And as we all know, there are obviously certain broader, the term Bob Jessup uses, which is quite a nice one, ecosystemic features. I mean, although the effects of the economic crisis have been uneven, most countries have at least had some impact of a broader, structural crisis. What caused the crisis? I'll tell you about that later. But there's a certain common issue of crisis, and also you have a certain dominance in the realm of ideas. Broadly speaking, despite the crisis, neoliberalism in the realm of ideas and policy is still very much on the offensive. So we do certainly have diversity between countries, but there are certain broader ecosystemic features, A, neoliberalism, and B, a long period of crisis. This leads us on to a couple of quite pressing questions. What has the role of supranational institutions been? Now, the literature tends to be very hyperbolic either way. Either the supranational institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and the EU are quite powerful, or no, they're bodies in crisis and have limited impact. I think the way to understand them really, and I look at the World Bank and the IMF one side and the EU on the other side separately, because they are quite distinct. With both of them, I think a useful concept to understand is partial institutional coupling. You know, we tend to often see institutions and practice as some kind of a conveyor belt. However, events of the last few years have highlighted is the extent to which institutions are only partially coupled. What does this mean? Well, if you take the World Bank and the IMF, on one hand you can argue they've had a major renaissance, you know, they are having far-reaching impact on policy and practice of countries experiencing crisis. But if you go back to the Asian financial crisis, one of the consequences of that was basically a number of countries from Russia to several Far Eastern economies spent the time since then stockpiling foreign exchange in a manner that in many respects was dysfunctional. I mean, why did Russia still have austerity while stockpile foreign exchange? Basically, so never have to go back to the IMF ever again. You know, so there was an interesting issue that a number of countries made some very hard and painful decisions so as to become partially disengaged in these bodies. This is quite interesting. In terms of Europeanization, the interesting issue is obviously there are common effects of Europe. What we know from empirical evidence, there are certain common pressures and practices. Interesting enough, also Europeanization has certain positive implications. For example, countries in the EU are more likely to attract FDI within the Eurozone rather than the countries outside the EU. So there are some positive features. However, again, you're talking about partial and selective coupling. I mean, the whole issue about Greece was you had this at several levels. Firstly, we know that Greece didn't really fully integrate in the Eurozone in the manner intended. You know that. And then secondly, within Greece, there's a sort of big gap between the large organizations and the state dimensions of the economy and the SMEs and underground economy, which are only partially regulated. So you had a number of breakdowns. You had breakdowns within Greece in that institutional coverage was never fully complete and uneven. And then obviously within the Eurozone, again, it transpired not to be nearly as closely coupled as initially thought. Now, you've got to be careful in using terms like coupling, because obviously the obvious assumption you can say, well, hell, you know, some institutions, like wasn't Greece decoupled, doesn't the Greek informal economy just simply do its own thing, you know, et cetera, et cetera. No, because obviously even the Greek informal economy makes certain demands on the Greek state. It's just a question of how many rights, how many demands, how much expectations. So it's not the question of areas being disengaged, however, only impartially engaged. Coupling can only be can be somewhat selective. In terms of actors, because of course when you look at institutions, obviously you're talking about structures. What is the role of social action? The interesting thing about the supranational level, I think you have two very interesting and very important actors. The first is multinationals. Again, the literature tends to be pretty much either optimistic multinationals bring investment and spread best practice, or multinationals ultimately drive by being mobile labour standards downwards. With a group of my colleagues in the finance group in Sheffield, we've been looking quite extensively. We've compiled broadened metrics of worker rights You know, you can measure worker rights in various ways. Collective rights, individual rights, social protection. The interesting thing is there's not a link between worker rights and FDI. So labour market deregulation doesn't necessarily make for more FDI. In fact, in some cases, it seems worker rights actually increase FDI. And this is, of course, quite odd because this goes against a lot of the literature, it goes against what the World Bank and the IMF are saying and so forth. Why is this? Well, obviously, multinationals go to context for different reasons, markets, skills, supply chain networks, all sorts of things. And labour cost is only one issue in the formula. And in some ways, multinationals and the kind of economies that have higher labour standards tend to have more mature markets, better skills bases, more advanced supply chain relationships. So the interesting thing is, empirically, we know that multinationals are both an agent for and against the raising of standards. And as I said, this is terribly interesting because nobody seems to have learned anything from this. The whole policy lessons still are very much need to deregulate labour markets further and so forth. I think the other issue is the other big transnational actor, oddly enough, are people. And this is quite weird because historically labour was an unusual commodity in the sense labour was relatively rooted. You know, labour tended to be rooted in occupations and space. What has happened over the particularly last decade, has been labour changing as to the type of commodity it is. Labour has become a lot more spatially mobile, and occupations have become a lot less fixed. Guy Standing talks about the rise of a global precariat, people who are condemned to unskilled, insecure jobs and have to move to seek work, to seek survival. And of course this is very true. Currently, 1 in every 5 people in the world are on the move. And this has very profound implications for how we understand national skills bases, national markets, politics. I mean, as we all know, one of the main areas the right has been able to get traction is on the issue of migration. And in some ways, it's an absurd debate. It's like, you know, King Canute of England trying to stop the sea from flowing, you know, trying to stop the tides. Other hand, this has all sorts of implications beyond simply what happens in the firm. Although, of course, it affects, you know, very profoundly, but it affects politics, society, and the consequences politically are unpredictable. It can favour more progressive politics. It can lead to obviously a very nasty right-wing xenophobic politics. But I think, as I said, the mobility of people is a very important one. We've tried to unpick a bit the limitations of trying to focus purely on the nation state in relation to supranational pressure. What about subnational diversity? I don't want to talk too long. I've already used 15 minutes of your time, and there are a few other issues I want to come to. But if you look at firm level survey evidence, and we've used various surveys over the years, I can talk about that more over questions. What we find is we've almost as much diversity within as between nations. Now, there are various reasons for this. The one is regional dynamics. For example, if you take a case like England, for political and historical reasons, the development trajectory in northeast England has been a lot less statist than the south. A lot more statist. If you look, the City of London is very, very deregulated, very free-flowing. In contrast, northeast England has had a very much more state-driven development trajectory. And with the cutbacks in government expenditure, it's interesting to see how this impacts on the nature of diversity within Britain. There are also sectoral dynamics. I mean, we all know that different sectors are associated with certain sets of practices. Motor cars, for example, it does seem to pay to production facilities close to major markets, fairly closely integrated supply chain relationships, and so forth. You also have, obviously, which goes for both the supra and the subnational level, the issue of complementarity. Now, complementarity is a huge debate about the term. Complementarity, in the crudest sense, means sets of rules and practices together that yield a better outcome than an analysis of their component parts would suggest. Rules and practices together that make for more than the component parts suggest. However, we tend to often think of complementarity as building on strength. You know, like, say, for example, in the German motor car industry, you have, you know, certain types of labor regulation, certain supply chain relationships, certain skills and training system, making for a highly effective and profitable motor car industry. However, complementarity can a lot be about compensating for systemic weaknesses. I'll give you an example at the subnational level, but to keep our talk more or less balanced, I'll give you an example at the supranational level. Obviously, we all know during the boom years of the 50s and the 60s, within the developed societies, you had a virtuous Cordorian circle of, you know, increases in wages, increases in demand. Now, what we know since the 70s is that virtuous circle has broken down. That virtuous circle has broken down. And there's been obviously an issue of fundamental crisis of consumer demand, and obviously great imbalances. Now, in the global system, the rise of sort of China and Germany as mega exporters, and the rise of other countries as mega borrowers and consumers. On one hand, it is complementary, obviously. I mean, from a German or Chinese point of view, unless people bought all their products, you know, they wouldn't be where they are. Other hand, from a consumer point of view, unless you could buy all those products, you know, you would also have problems. But I mean, on the other hand, this is a fundamental imbalance in the global system. China and Germany, United States and Britain have a relationship that on one hand we would say was, well, complementary. Issues of mopping up vast amounts of production, recycling, you know, profits back in the form of, you know, and so forth. However, this is, as we know, very much a product of global weakness. This leads us to, of course, perhaps the biggest maker of diversity, that uneven and yet, shall we say, common nature of systemic change. Look, obviously, the global economy hasn't been in great shape since the early 70s. It's been a period of mediocre growth at best, volatility, and it obviously the crisis has worsened. Now, this leads us to a few questions. The first is a question which really troubles the historical institutionalists, is the issue of institutional shelf life. We all know the post-war settlements, you know, which the welfare state, you know, the virtuous Cordorian circle of improved working conditions, improved ability to consume, you know, all that. Now, that was based on really forced social compromises. Countries knew that if they didn't have those kind of compromises that underlay those arrangements, they wouldn't exist. There wouldn't be another chance at Germany. Austria wouldn't exist. And you've got to understand, I mean, Sweden in the 20s nearly fought a civil war. Finland did. I mean, Britain was not in a very good shape, you know. Even the States, as you know, obviously the Great Recession and all that. You know, all these countries had these huge, and you had obviously fascism, war, you know, so in the sense, people's heads were banged together. And, you know, obviously you can argue after a while, as memories of that fade, nobody likes compromising, and the whole deal comes under pressure. Somewhat more theoretically speaking, you know, the economist Karl Polanyi, you know, talked about double movement. You have a movement towards more market, and then the markets run away with themselves, and there's a forced compromise, and you have a more state-driven trajectory, and that brings with it inefficiencies of its own, and, you know, after a while the deal breaks down. Now, on one hand, obviously that's partially true. You know, we had a period of excessive markets, and obviously there's a sort of growing realization in some ways that you need to move back towards a more status thing. The trouble with people who use Polanyi, they tend to see things as kind of, you know, a pendulum. You know, things swing one way then the other, and this is not really a very good understanding of history. You know, if you look at the German social theorist of the 20s, Walter Benjamin, argued the angel of history moves along, leaving rubble behind. We may be indeed moving back to an era of more statism, and there's very strong evidence for this, I'm telling you all sorts of reasons, but it's not going to be the statism of before. And what we understand by statism may be a profoundly different thing. So even if you veer back towards statism, it doesn't mean to say it's in a form recognizable as before. I mean, if you just take a crude example, take the United States, in some ways it's a very statist economy. You know, the runaway penal sector with 2.5 million people banged up. You know, you have the high-tech industry that relies very much on the military industrial spending, and on cross-subsidization from the state and non-profit sector. You know, the universities do a lot of R&D. So you can see even before the crisis, the states was getting very statist. And perhaps you might see acceleration of those sort of kinds of statism, penalization, military spending, rather than, you know, the kind of nice, cuddly European social democratic statism. But what caused the crisis? And this is actually an interesting point. If, you know, okay, because Polanyi obviously just, you know, assumes that institutional arrangements tend after a while to excess. This doesn't really help you totally. The other issue which doesn't really help you, which is part, but again, there's an element of truth to it, is the issue of economic long waves. You know, because we all know, if you go back to the Middle Ages and before, you have, you know, periods of growth, long periods of recession, long periods of growth, and in between, you know, periods of changeover, shall we say. Now, the trouble with economic long waves, you know, contractive waves, is they're short on predictive power. You know, if you look back in historical evidence, they aren't all of the same length. And, you know, if everybody knew exactly when they would come, why they ran out of steam, and this is a frustrating thing about analysis of economic long waves. However, there's one thing quite interesting about them, and that is certainly the recent ones we know about have been coinciding with energy transitions. What do I mean? Well, global demand for oil is going up. Okay. However, what's very important to note, for the last 5 years, the portion of oil as part of the global energy mix is actually going down. The portion of oil as part of the global energy mix is actually going down. And even if you believe in there's masses of oil out there, masses of gas out there, even people in the industry admit this has happened. And there's no evidence that this is going to change. Now, if you go back to the previous Great Depression, shall we say, the whole issue about that was a time of a long transition from coal to oil. What happens when you have energy transitions? First of all, the nature of input costs changes. It changes very profoundly. It doesn't mean to say necessarily energy comes mechanically more expensive. I mean, the whole thing about the switch over to oil was cheap. But it fundamentally changes the competitiveness of firms, regions, and countries. I mean, the whole issue of the long decline of Northern England, that was about industries and regions that built themselves on coal seams, dealing with fundamental changes in the nature of the inputs. It doesn't mean to say necessarily we won't find alternatives, we won't be able to, there won't be an abandonment of unconventional oil sources, whatever. But at the same time, the changes of input costs shifts fundamentally. And what happens when the changes, and you have these kind of changes in input costs and changes in the structural foundation of regional and national competitiveness? Basically, owners of highly fungible capital are favoured over owners of infungible capital. Owners of fungible capital are favoured over owners of infungible capital. Obvious question is, don't I mean rentiers? No, I don't. Because obviously we know that in today's world, a lot of the owners of fungible capital are things like sovereign wealth funds. So it's not necessarily unrestrained rentiers, we understand them, but certainly owners of fungible capital over owners of infungible capital. And once you do that, you obviously have all the consequences that go with that. Shall I end on a pessimistic note? Well, and I don't know. I know that's the trouble with academics. They tend to,
It's all right. After this, they'll lunch. So
yeah. If you look at economic long waves, we tend to think of them like this, don't we? We tend to think of like this. If you look,
not necessarily. I mean, if you are an economic growth guy, you wouldn't think about this.
No. Well, look. I mean, if you look at, if you take your point, the time of the birth of the modern, it was like steps up a staircase, wasn't it? The steps up a staircase. There was, the global economy has grown for 500 years on and off, but it has grown very substantially. However, if you go back to the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages, you had times when there were steps going down a staircase. And when you have profound ruptures and changes, the question is, are we going to be walking level? Or are we possibly going to be walking downstairs? Thanks.